We're going to continue on with our study of the Apostles' Creed. Today we're going to be looking at the fourth article of the Apostles' Creed, that being, He suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. So this is the fourth article of the Apostles' Creed. And before we really get into it this morning, I want you to think about this creed. Like I said, this is Christianity in a minute. I mean, you're talking about just a short and simple summary of the Christian faith and of the gospel message, which means a lot of stuff is left out. And not even just stuff that doesn't matter. I mean, a lot of important and essential things to the faith are not included in this creed. It's a really condensed version of Christianity. So that means every word, every syllable within this creed has importance and has meaning. And that's what's really interesting about the fourth article. That when we get here to this creed that is such a short summary of the Christian faith, we find a name that you would think would be odd to be mentioned here. The name of Pontius Pilate. Think about that. Here we have this creed that summarizes Christianity. It doesn't mention Adam. It doesn't mention Seth. It doesn't mention Noah. It doesn't mention Abraham. It doesn't even mention Isaac or Jacob or Judah. It doesn't mention Moses, and it doesn't mention David. But here in the midst of this creed that is so central to the Christian faith, we have a man by the name of Pontius Pilate. Think about that. Here we have Pilate mentioned, and you may be wondering why that's the case. You know, I've heard some people put that it's almost like a dog sitting at the dinner table. That here we have the good news of the gospel. Here we have this message of hope to the world. And here we have almost like this dirty, unclean animal sitting in the midst of this table. Now, some people might welcome the dogs to the table, but the whole point of that picture is this, is that it's almost odd that Pilate is included in this. But the reason that Pilate is included in this creed is because what Pilate does, God uses him as a tool to bring about His plan of redemption. That God uses this Gentile, God uses this unclean man, this man that was not a follower of Christ, this man who was not even a follower of the Mosaic Law. He uses this outsider as a tool to bring about His plan that He had from the very foundations of the world. And I think it's fitting that Pilate was the one that was used. You know, we don't know much about him. What we know about him is actually his later life. We don't know much about his early life. Now, we can kind of guess what he might have done or his background. For instance, if you look at his name, when you look at the name Pontius, what that is referring to is an actual class of people that was there in Roman society. He would be viewed as someone in the equestrian part of that society, so that's just denoting his kind of background and where he came from. The equestrians, they would be people that are more or less kind of like upper middle class, if we could compare it to our modern culture. So he's not like lighting the world on fire, but he's definitely doing better than some of the rest of the people that are around. But what's really interesting is this name Pilate. This name Pilate means skilled with a javelin. So some people believe that this is a name that was given to him because of his military exploits. So what some people theorize is that Pilate might have been a military man. He might have been somebody that had this military prowess, and he rose up in the ranks in the military, and that eventually got him this position as governor over Judea. Now, is that the case? We don't know for sure. But if that is the case, it would make sense because Pilate carries over a lot of military tendencies in his rule as governor of Judea. He was a man that was very quick to shed blood. And he really didn't think twice about it. In fact, we see an example of this in Luke's gospel. You can find this in Luke chapter number 13. It talks about how there were Galileans that went to the temple to worship, and while they were there worshiping, Pilate had them struck down and killed so that their blood was intermingled with the blood of their sacrifices. Man, he's a pretty brutal dude, right? I mean, most people, and you think back to olden days, and even like we see this in the Bible, there's cities of sanctuary that if you go to one of the cities of the Levites, that you would be protected from somebody that would want to shed your blood. Or if you go to the temple, if you go to the house of God, that while you were there in the house of God, you would have sanctuary, you would have protection. Here by Pilate doing this is showing he has no care for Jewish customs or Jewish rules or laws. He cares nothing about that. And if he sees fit to take someone out, guess what he's going to do? He's going to take them out. And it's this mindset that eventually gets Pilate removed from his governorship of Judea. Eventually, there are some Samaritans that are looking for artifacts from Moses near Mount Gerizim where they worship, and Pilate has them killed. And this upsets the people so much that he then is brought before the emperor to answer for this, and he is removed for having these people killed. So it's this bloody attitude that Pilate has that not only he carried throughout his rule as governor of Judea, it's eventually what got him ousted. And that's why it should be no surprise to us that we hear that it was Pilate who was the one who had Jesus executed. That's not what is surprising to us. What is surprising is this, is that Pilate actually was trying to get Jesus off the hook. That's what's surprising about this. Pilate did not care to take life, and Pilate did not care to dishonor the Jews or to not observe their customs or rules or laws. Pilate had no care about the Jewish people. So it should be surprising to us that Pilate was actually seeking to save a Jew from death. You would think, in Pilate's mind, here's just another crazy Jew, let's get him out of the way and we're not going to think anything of it. But that's not what we see right here. In fact, when we look here at John chapter number 18, after Pilate examines Jesus, you see Jesus is brought to him under the charges of sedition. He's brought to him because everybody is saying Jesus is claiming to be king. And under the Roman Empire, there is only one king, that being Caesar, right? So if somebody's claiming to be king, obviously they are coming against the empire, which means they are now an enemy of the state. So Jesus was brought in and examined by Pilate to see if that was the case. And whenever he asked Jesus, "Are you a king?" and Jesus' response to him is, "That's what you're saying. But here's the thing, my kingdom's not of this world. My kingdom's not of this world. If it was, then my people would fight for me. My people would fight for it. That I am a king, you have said it. I am a king, but my kingdom is not of this world." And after Pilate examines Jesus, he does not feel that Jesus is this rebel and this threat that the Jews painted him out to be. That's why when we get down to verse number 38 of John 18, it says, "Pilate said to him, 'What is truth?' And when Pilate had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, 'I find no fault in him at all.'" Did you hear that? Here he was brought to Pilate under the charges of sedition, that he was leading an insurrection, he was leading a rebellion against the Roman Empire, and Pilate says, "I find no fault in him." But to try to appease the Jews, what does he do? As we continue reading on into chapter number 19, it says in verse number 1 that Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. He scourged him. That is what we're seeing there in the Apostles' Creed, that he, speaking of Jesus, suffered under Pontius Pilate. This suffering came by rods and by whips. That he was beaten with what you all probably know as the cat of nine tails. It's this whip that on the end of it had bits of metal and bits of bone connected to these leather straps, that as it would come and make contact with flesh, it would tear into flesh, slicing it like ribbons. And at times it would even get lodged into the flesh, and entire chunks of flesh could be removed from an individual as they're being beaten by this instrument of torture. And this scourging that Jesus endured, it goes along with the words of Isaiah, that it says that this suffering servant would be marred beyond recognition. He would no longer bear the resemblance of a man. Folks, by the time Jesus was beaten by Pilate, not only was he beaten beyond recognition, he no longer even resembled himself, folks. He barely bore the visage of a man. He was so beaten, so tortured, he suffered so immensely that when you looked upon him, you would probably wonder, how is this individual even alive? That is what he suffered under Pontius Pilate. But that's not where it ends. You see, Pilate, most likely in his mind, he was thinking that the bloodshed there would be enough to satiate the rage and the anger of the Jews. But when they presented Jesus before him, even mocking Jesus by placing this crown of thorns on his head, putting a rod in his hand to symbolize a scepter, and wrapping his body that had all these open wounds in it, in this scarlet. As he stood before the Jews, instead of seeing him as their Messiah, instead of seeing him as their king, they instead turned to Pilate and said, "Crucify him. Crucify him." Folks, crucifixion was a penalty that was reserved for the worst of the worst. It was the ultimate form of humiliation under the Roman government. If they wanted to make an example of somebody as to why you do not go against Caesar, as to why you do not cross the Roman Empire, they would crucify you. And here the Jews are demanding that Jesus would be crucified. One of the worst punishments and the worst deaths imaginable. Folks, even this word excruciating, how many of y'all have heard of that word before? Folks, it has its origins in crucifixion. Excruciating literally means out of the cross. We get this word that means immense pain or agonizing pain, something that's beyond even comprehension. Its roots is in crucifixion. This is the worst imaginable death. And this is what the Jews are demanding of Jesus. And instead of simply going along with it, what does Pilate do? Pilate's like, why? Why would I do this? Why would I crucify him? If you want him to die, you kill him. But I find no fault in him. Why do you want him to die? And that's what they go on to say here, that as they're demanding him to be crucified, look at what it says in verse number 7. It says, "The Jews answered him, 'We have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God.' Therefore, when Pilate heard saying that he was more afraid, and went again in the praetorium and said to Jesus, 'Where are you from?' But Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and the power to release you?" Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." When Pilate therefore heard the saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, "Away with him, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" Then the chief of priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. Then they took Jesus and led him away. Right here, we see in verse number 12 that Pilate sought to release Jesus. That should blow our minds. Think about that. And that's even something that different historians and different scholars write, to think that this is somehow innovation, or this is something that John was just making up, because it blows their mind as well. They're like, why would Pilate want to release him? Pilate does not care about killing. Pilate does not care about the Jewish people. Pilate does not care about whether or not someone would live or die. Why would he want to release Jesus? What difference would that make to him? And it tells us right here why he feels that way. Because one, he sees that Jesus is not guilty of the crimes he is accused of. But two, it says there that Jesus is believed by his followers and believed by some to be the Son of God. Now, being a Roman and being somebody that comes from this background where they have many different gods and many different people who in their religion are sons of God, being, we've talked about this in previous weeks, not in the sense that Christ is the true Son of God, but sons of God in the sense that they are the offspring of their gods. This made Pilate fearful. He did not want to incur the wrath of this Jewish God. Even though he did not care about the Jewish people, he wanted to keep the peace not only with his emperor, but also with the gods. So he sought to release Jesus. But whenever the Jews turned the table and made it apparent that if Pilate did not follow through, that they would then seek help from Rome itself. They would go to Caesar and accuse Pilate of harboring a fugitive of the state, or not doing to this seditious king as what Caesar would probably want done. That's when he finally followed through with it and handed Jesus over to be crucified. That's something that's interesting. That he would want to release Jesus, but I think this is just a testament to who Jesus is. Here's this pagan man who knows nothing really of Jesus and who has a limited understanding of the Jews and their religion. But when he is in the presence of Jesus, even in this short amount of time, we see something changing in him. We see that it had a lasting effect upon him. Now, whether it had an effect that for salvation, that's left to be unsaid. There's some Christian groups who believe that Pilate eventually converted, and they actually believe he was a martyr. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. The Bible doesn't say, and we really don't have a clear historical record as to what happened to Pilate after the crucifixion of Jesus. But what we need to take away from this, and the whole purpose of this is to show us this, is that this event that took place is not myth. It's not something that was made up, but our faith and the Christian faith, the reason that Pontius Pilate is mentioned in the Apostles' Creed is because our beliefs are rooted in historical fact. It's rooted in historical reality. This is not simply a bedtime story that you read to your children, but rather this is something that you read in the annals of history. This is something that you can read not just in these Christian sources. You know, we have these first century sources. We have the Gospels that detail the crucifixion of Christ, but we also have later sources, both in the first century, second century, and then so on, of Christian writers who affirm that Jesus Christ was from Nazareth, that Jesus Christ was a rabbi, that Jesus Christ was the Messiah, and He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. We have Christian sources that affirm that, but we also have secular sources. We have people like Tacitus. He was a Roman historian who wrote about how the Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate. So here we have a Roman historian. He has no skin in the game. He has nothing to gain by mentioning that. Yet when people are mentioning Pilate, Pilate's claim to fame is killing Jesus. Not only do we have Roman historians, we have Jewish historians. We have a man by the name of Josephus. Josephus wrote about how Jesus was crucified by Pilate. So here we have sources in the second century that affirm the historicity of the crucifixion of Jesus. And that is the reason that Pilate is mentioned right here. Pilate is mentioned right here to ground this creed in history and in reality. It's here to show us that Jesus is not just something that was made up. Jesus is not a myth. Jesus is not a legend. Folks, this would have happened in too short amount of time for this to simply have just been made up. People today, there's people going around questioning whether or not Jesus actually existed. No serious scholar thinks that. Now you might question whether the things recorded about Him in the Gospels are true, and I'll grant you that, but you cannot say that Jesus did not exist. That is a historical reality. Even atheists and secular scholars, someone like Bart Ehrman, I was reading one of his articles this morning in preparation for this, and he said no one questioned this. This is not something that anybody questioned. And the reason that no one questioned this is because it would have developed too fast for it simply to have been made up. It's a historical fact that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified by Pontius Pilate. We have two early sources that tell us this. And even think about this. If you have people writing in the early second century of an event that took place in the early first century, that's too short of a span of time for people to simply have made that up. Historians would have known, you know what? I don't remember Pilate ever doing this. You know what? I don't get this. I don't understand. Where did any of this come from? No, it shows you that this was already an established fact. That this is something that everyone was aware of. And as people are going out and preaching the gospel, as people are going out and Christianity goes from this small sect in Jerusalem to being a religion that spans to different parts of the Roman Empire. It goes all the way from Italy to Asia. As it begins to grow and expand, people are wondering where this religion is coming from. And that's where they stand up and say it stems from the Christ. These people are the Christians. You see, that name Christian used to be a slur. That name Christian used to be used to mock believers. And yet it was something that believers adopted and took on for themselves as their identity. They're like, yes, I am a Christian. Yes, I am a follower of Christ. Yes, my identity is rooted in Him. Yes, my foundation for my life is in Jesus Christ of Nazareth. And that's what we're seeing right here. We're seeing all of that laid out in the 4th article of the Creed, that Jesus suffered under Pilate, that this is a historical reality. And after He had suffered immensely, He was crucified. I've discussed it at length before. You all know the details, how as you're hanging there on the tree, how you can't even catch your breath, that you've got to pull yourself up by the nails driven in your wrist just so you can catch your breath. To even draw breath would be so agonizing. And people could hang there for hours, and for some unfortunate souls, even days, and suffer. But we know that Jesus, He suffered immensely, but it's there on the cross that on that same day He perished. And that's something that we need to understand. Jesus died on the cross. You know, there's different groups out there today that question this. You know, I guess one of the most prominent groups you might know of would be the Muslims. Those who follow Islam believe that Jesus did not actually die on the cross. They believe that somebody else was a stand-in for Jesus, and they died, and Jesus actually survived the cross. Now, that's a more modern interpretation. Some of them actually believe that, yes, Jesus was crucified, but Jesus did not actually die as a result of His crucifixion. It only appeared that He died. Now, either one of those interpretations are wrong. And the reason that is incorrect is because, one, we know it's a historical fact that Jesus died on the cross. Not only do we have these secular sources, but every Christian source from the first century and then afterward affirmed Jesus died on the cross. Even think about what we're reading right here. We're reading the Gospel of John. We're talking about John the Beloved, John the Apostle. We're talking about Jesus' companion, the one who was with Him not only through His scourging, but stood there with His mother at the foot of the cross and watched Jesus breathe His last breath. This is not coming from secondary sources. This is coming straight from the horse's mouth. John witnessed the crucifixion of Jesus, and John saw Jesus die. Not only did he see Him die, but the Romans even made sure He was dead. What did they do? They pierced His side, folks. They took a spear and ran it into His side, and the spear literally pierced His heart sac. That's what they believed happened. That Jesus, under all this immense stress, that His body had all these fluids built up, and whenever they ran the spear into His side, it pierced His heart sac, and that's why out of it came blood and water. All this fluid that had built up eventually flowed out of Him. Folks, there's no surviving that. There's no coming back from the cross. I mean, the cross would have killed Him, but literally having a spear ran into your heart, folks, there's no surviving that. Jesus died. That is a historical reality. Jesus died on the cross. He did not appear to be dead. He was not like half dead. He was dead. Everybody got that? And after He died, It says there at the end of John 19 that they took his body down from the cross. Joseph of Arimathea along with Nicodemus, both of whom were secret disciples of Jesus. And if you're there in in chapter 19, look at verse number 40. It says, "Then they took the body of Jesus, bound it in strips of linen with the spices, as is the custom of the Jews to bury. Now in this place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had been laid. So there they laid Jesus because of the Jews' preparation day, for the tomb was nearby." So Joseph lends Jesus his tomb for a quick burial because the tomb is in the same vicinity, it's in the same location as the crucifixion. We know the crucifixion took place at this location called Golgotha, the place of the skull, Calvary. It's in this rock quarry, but it's in this rock quarry where a garden was planted. It's in this place of death that there was also the newness of life, that they had brought in dirt, they cultivated the land, and they planted a garden. And it's in this garden where this tomb was hewn out of the stone. They carved out a tomb in this stone, and no man had been laid there before. So Joseph, since he was a disciple of Jesus, wanted to give him a proper burial. And after Jesus had died, he took him and he placed him in his tomb. And it's there near the same location where he died, where he was also buried. This is the fourth article of the Creed. Christ suffered, Christ died, and Christ was buried. Now, all of this, every aspect of this, there's no part of it that is without importance. There's no part of it that is without significance. Every aspect of this is to point us to our salvation. It's to point us to the purpose of Christ coming. Christ was born under the law to redeem those who were under the law. Christ came in the likeness of men, not so that He would be exalted, but Christ came so that He might suffer. He is the suffering servant. Here we see in His suffering that He suffered under Pilate. The purpose of that is to take away our suffering from us. All of us are slaves to sin. All of us are dead in our sins and trespasses. All of us are out here trying to work, trying to labor, trying to toil to bring ourselves to a place of righteousness, trying to be good enough, but we will never be good enough. So Christ suffered to end our suffering. We are going to die. This life is filled with pain and sorrows. Amen. As a result of our sin, we are going to suffer. We are going to endure pain. We are going to endure trials and testings. But Christ suffered to alleviate our suffering. But Christ was crucified. His suffering wasn't just a scourging. His suffering was a crucifixion. Now there's so much we can get into with this. We even go back to the garden. That there in the garden we see that a tree brought about the death of mankind. When they ate of the tree of knowledge, a living tree brought about death. But it was a dead tree, the cross, that brought about the fruit of life, that being Jesus and His sacrifice. A living tree brought death, but a dead tree brought life to many. Folks, we can keep going with different typological pictures in the Old Testament of why Christ was crucified, of the importance of the cross. We know that it says there in the Mosaic Law that cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. Christ hung on a tree to take away our curse. We were cursed by sin and death, but Christ took that curse upon Himself so that we might find life and righteousness in Him. Folks, we can keep going. Think about even with Moses. As they're dying of thirst there in the wilderness. They come across this water, but this water is bitter. This water is poisonous. This water will kill them. The same thing that would give them life is the same thing that would also destroy them. And it's only when Moses takes a piece of wood and puts that wood into the bitter water that this source of death became a source of life, that they could drink and they could have living water. Folks, it's only by the cross, it's only by the wood that Christ was nailed to, that He hung on, that He died on, that we can drink living water and we do not have to taste the bitterness of death. Y'all want me to keep going? I will. Think about this. Christ is the rock. He is the chief cornerstone of our salvation. And Paul points us back to the wilderness, that as they're dying of thirst there in the wilderness, that Moses takes his staff, he takes a rod, he takes a piece of wood, and he strikes the stone, and when he strikes the stone with this piece of wood, living water flows out of it so that the Israelites might drink and live. Folks, that is the cross where Christ was struck. He was killed on this piece of wood, but it's by our cornerstone being struck that we can drink living water and survive. Are y'all hearing this morning? The cross has been present from the very beginning. Even think of the Israelites. Over and over again, God always met their need. We've seen this in the examples I mentioned. That any time the Israelites cried out, God always met their need. But what did they always do? They always forgot. Then in one moment they're praising God, and then the next they're complaining against Him. You know, it might be a different ethnic group and it may be a different time, but people never change. Amen or ouch? You know, they're complaining against God, murmuring against Him that God did not meet their needs, that God had brought them to this wilderness place. And as a result, these venomous snakes, these fiery serpents were sent among the Israelites, and they began biting them. These serpents began biting the Israelites, and they were dying as a result. So what does Moses do? Moses takes this brazen serpent and he places it on a pole, and he raises it up. He elevates this brazen serpent, this bronze serpent, on a wooden pole, and anyone who would look to this brazen serpent in faith would be delivered from the curse of the serpent. Folks, are y'all seeing it? Are you hearing it this morning? Yes. We know from the very beginning that the serpent there in the garden caused the fall of man. But it's also promised there from the very beginning that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. And that's why Jesus said, just as the serpent was raised up there in the wilderness, so too must the Son of Man be raised up. He must be exalted. And if He is exalted, then He will draw all people to Himself. He will save many by His exaltation. Folks, Jesus hung on the cross so that in the same way that a bronze serpent that was raised up, that anyone who looked to it in faith would be delivered from the curse of the serpent, that anyone who looks to Christ, who was crucified in faith, can be delivered from the curse of the serpent. Your sin may have brought death, but Christ on the cross brings us life through faith. Are you hearing it this morning, church? This is good. I'm getting excited. Turn to your neighbor and say, are you excited? I'm excited. This makes me excited that there was purpose in this. That's why Jesus said what He did there in John 19. No one takes my life from me, Pilate, you're not the orchestrator of all this. The Jews aren't the ones that are orchestrating all this. You aren't the one who brought all these things to be, but this has been my Father's plan from the foundation of the universe. That even before a word was spoken, even before anything was breathed into existence, God's plan was to come down to us and die for us. Think about that. Everything we've read so far in this creed has been a downward motion. We have God the Father Almighty who created the heavens and the earth. And then what happens? The next article, the incarnation. We have God the Son, God dwelling among us. God came from heaven down to earth. God, who was exalted, did not treat His equality with God as a reason to reject this calling, but Christ, being obedient to the will of the Father, left His exalted abode and humbly came down here to the earth. And what did He do here on the earth? He was born of a Virgin Mary. And now we're seeing He suffered and died and was buried. The King of the universe was born a peasant, suffered a criminal's death. He died, and now He is buried in the same earth that He formed with His hands. Think about that. That is the movement we're seeing. That God comes from glory. He comes down to earth. He is humbled beyond what we can even comprehend. But that is not the end of His humiliation. But He continues until He is buried in the same ground that the Word of God spoke into existence. Think about that. Folks, this is the lengths that God was willing to go through so that you might know Him and you might have a relationship with Him. That we serve a God who is exalted, but we serve a God who is also willing to come down to us. That He was willing to come amongst us and suffer for us. How humbling is that?